So to get us started, it's my pleasure to introduce our President and CEO, Milton Little. He really needs no introduction to most of you, but for those of you who don't know his background, I just want to share a little bit about him. He is our President and CEO. In June, he'll be celebrating 11 years as the President and CEO of the United Way of Greater Atlanta. Prior to that, he was the President of the United Way of Massachusetts Bay. Before that, he was with the National Urban League. Then he had a corporate career with Lucent Technologies, AT&T. He was with MDRC. He's a graduate of Morehouse College right here in Atlanta. Has an MA from Columbia University with a degree in sociology. And I think I can speak for all of us at the United Way and say that it's a pleasure to serve under his leadership at the United Way. Please join me in welcoming Milton Little.
Thank you, Tiffany. Good morning, everybody. Good to see you all here. Before we get started, let me just ask you to keep the victims, the families, the community surrounding the school in Broward County in your thoughts and in your private prayers. One more evidence of tragedy, one more evidence of man's inhumanity to man. And I hope one day we can get the right policies in place that will prevent another family and another parent from experiencing what those in Broward County are experiencing. I look across this room and it's a great group. I know a lot of you, smart, talented, capable, good-looking folks. Only the good-looking folks acknowledge that. Is that it? Okay, I don't know what the rest of y'all are thinking, but the good-looking folks in this room, there's a lot of social capital in this room, a lot of expertise in this room, a lot of good intention. And what InForum is all about is about sort of giving you an opportunity to come together, to hear from wonderful speakers, but perhaps more importantly, to sort of get better connected to the like-minded souls here in Atlanta who are doing such incredible work for families and communities and neighborhoods. Every day, each one of you is making a difference, and we ought to celebrate that. And I'm always happy to have some great speakers come to InForum, and today is no different. Today we're going to talk about the power of place-based work and its impact on poverty. And so, that is what brings us together, and I hope you bring your questions and your thoughts and commentary to today's session. I think it's fair to say each one of us in this room is capable of hitting a home run anytime. I mean, those of you who run organizations, those of you who are in organizations are making a difference every day. You're hitting home runs every day. But I'm gonna carry that baseball metaphor just a little further. We're hitting these home runs, but our team standing's not changing. We're not moving up in the rankings. There's a new ranking of the cities with the highest levels of inequality. The top 10. Unfortunately, I've lived in 4 of those cities. I'm beginning to think I'm the problem. I've lived in San Francisco, I've lived in Boston, I've lived in DC, I've lived in New York. I'm living in Atlanta. Atlanta is once again the most unequal city in America when you think about income inequality. We rank only second to Charlotte in terms of the lack of social mobility. So our home runs are not adding up to enough energy and outcome to change where we sit in the standings. And so what's that suggest? That if we really want to be all-star players, if we really want to turn those home runs into significant wins and progress, we're probably going to have to play from a different playbook. We're probably going to have to think a little harder about what real collaboration is. I grew up in an era where the definition of collaboration among nonprofit organizations was an unnatural act between non-consenting players. That's what they said collaboration was. That you got there only because you had to. You didn't really want to be there. When they asked you to put something on the table, you put as little as you could just to say that you were in the game. You know, and I think there's still a little too much of that definition of collaboration. But I say if we want to change where we are in the rankings, if we want to change where we are in the standings, if we want to be a different kind of team with a different kind of outcome, we're going to have to think hard about what that collaboration, what that coalition building is going to be. So the challenge that we have offered at United Way to this region is to sort of look at what we do through the eyes of children. You know, only the hard-hearted among us can turn their back on a child. But if we can sort of measure regional progress against an outcome for children, ought that not be a way for us to sort of coalesce and bring the best of all of us to that work? Because a child can't prosper unless the parents and caregivers prosper. A child can't prosper unless that child lives in a community with a bunch of assets that are all being directed to his or her well-being. You know, no child lives by him or herself, and they live in a community, and the best children's outcomes come in those communities that work the best. And so, you know, we'll be serving neighborhoods if we focused on children. We'll be serving the caregivers if we focus on children. The work that we do around income, the work that we do to end health disparities, if you measure the progress that we are making in those subject areas through the well-being of children, that'll tell us if we're making the best difference, because there is no community in America, ladies and gentlemen, that can claim it is a good community for everyone that doesn't have children prospering. And we are not having our children prosper in Greater Atlanta. There's 500,000 of them living in communities of low or very low child well-being. None of us can be proud of that. But it doesn't mean you're not hitting a home run. It just means we need a different playbook to turn those home runs into collective action, collective wins, so that every child does the very best they can. So what we're going to do, just to lighten the mood up a little bit, you know, because we've got philanthropists in this room and we've got philanthropists all across the region, we need to engage more deeply in this work. We've got nonprofit partners and government partners and other folks, you know, represented in this room. We're going to take a couple of minutes. I'm going to ask you to sort of introduce yourselves to the folks in this, at your table. And I'm going to hope that you just didn't come with the folks that you work with every day and you sat at the same table. I hope there's a stranger or two or three or four among you. I know what you guys, some of you guys over there didn't do the right homework, but I want you to just spend, we're going to spend 5 minutes just introducing yourselves, introduce your organization, you know, say a little bit about why you're here and why you're committed to this work. And then we're going to come back, and then I'm going to find out how many different kinds of organizations were represented at the table. And so we're going to do that with a little show of hands. So that's the audience participation part of this morning before we get started. So the clock starts now. Take 5 minutes just to introduce yourselves to the folks there, and we'll come back. Thank you. Thank you for indulging me in that exercise. So here's the quiz. All right, by a show of hands, how many tables had 3 organizations represented? All right, that's a wow, okay. How many had 4? How many had 6 organizations? Even 6. All right, Ann. All right. Well, again, that tells us who's here, and that tells us how many folks, have the same sort of spirit, the same intent in mind, the same collective energy and sense of ideas and possibilities for what we can do in this community. So let's figure out how we can find the right playbook that gets us all collaborating in a much more meaningful way, so that we change our standing. There can be no pride in being the city with the greatest income inequality. There can be no pride, being the second best, second worst in terms of social mobility. Many of you have been around long enough when they used to say, thank God for Mississippi, because, we're not in the bottom. We cannot say thank God for Charlotte because the kids are worse off in Charlotte. That just doesn't work, We can say thank God for the people in this room who want to make a difference. Thank all of our energy and spirit that sort of brings us together and that has us committed to this important work. And so the rest of this morning is going to be about how we talk about, think about, and hear examples of some of this powerful place-based work and the difference that it's making. Let's bring all of our attention to that conversation. Right now, I'd like to introduce a good and dear friend, a member of the United Way board, Rick Aronson. Rick is the agency liaison. Rick represents all of the funded agency partners on our board and brings your insight and experience to bear in the decision-making process that our board goes through around community assets, resources, deployment, and the like. Rick joined JF&CS in 2004 as the Chief Operating Officer. He became the CEO in 2015. He's a trained attorney. He's smart, capable. He's one of those people who smiled, and when I asked if the good-looking people were in the room, he knew I was talking to him. And so those of you who don't know Rick, this is an opportunity for you to be introduced to a really smart, capable leader, somebody who has believed for a long time in our great causes and works his agency to align, to support, and to drive in the communities that he serves the goals that we all share. So without further ado, Rick Aronson.
Thank you, Milton. I wanted to talk for a minute or two about the Child Wellbeing Index. And I was told to keep it real, so I'll keep it real and I'll keep it short because we have some amazing panelists to hear from today. I will tell you that when I first heard about the Child Wellbeing Index, like I trust many of you, had some questions. How will this affect my agency? Honestly, how will this affect my allocation? How will they transition to this new priority? How will we fit into the measurement framework and into these priority zip codes that are on the map in red and orange behind me? But I took the time to dig in. And after digging in and learning about the movement, the careful approach, all of the planning that went into this, I've drank the Kool-Aid. I understand the importance of the initiative, and I now know how my agency fits today and how I'd like it to fit into the future. When Milton was up here a minute ago, he didn't use the word I or even United Way very often. He kept saying, we will do this, we will come together, we have work to do. And that's really the transition that I had to make as a leader of my organization and as a collective partner with all of you. It's not about it's not about JF&CS, it's about what we collectively and together will do as a community. I know that we have the partnership, we will adapt, and we will have the commitment to grow this score. I know we can do it, and I know we can only do it if we work together. There's one thing I want to say about the process, and that is this. Not only is United Way dedicated to improving the child well-being of children, they are equally dedicated to all of us in this room. They have been a true partner to us. I may be in a little bit of the special handling unit because I'm talking to all of you, but I can promise you and trust you that they are as committed to you all, the partners, as they are to the movement itself, and they know that we can't get there without our collective help. We at JF&CS recognize that we can accomplish more working together. We're no longer talking about doing everything from cradle to grave. Just the math doesn't work like that. You can't be great at everything. So how do you solve the big problems? You work together as a collective, and you gel around one common idea. And this idea in this room is child well-being. And this is something that we can all wrap our work around. Whether you're working with families, whether you're working in schools, those issues directly affect the well-being of the children that we're going to improve thanks to this important work. We believe in the shared goal, and I ask you all to believe in the shared goal as well. So we are ready, and I hope you all are as well. From this well-attended room, it seems like you're ready to go. The question is, how do we do it? And today we will learn from experts that have. And so now I'd like to start by kicking off the discussion with Frank Fernandez. Frank joined the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation in 2014 to lead and implement the Westside Neighborhood Prosperity Fund. Now, this is a program that's designed to contribute to the transformational revitalization and development of Vine City, English Avenue, Castleberry Hill, and other adjacent neighborhoods. Frank, thank you for your service and for sharing your expertise with us today. So I'd like to invite you to come on up.
So good morning. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing, but also kind of serve as the moderator. So I just wanted to give you a quick overview of what the plan is. So you're going to hear from us to talk a little bit about what today's theme is, which is how do the role that place-based work has in eliminating poverty. And in doing so, what I'm hoping the three of us could do is really key in on a few themes and really make this as interactive as possible, because that's really what today is about. So, we can share some of the things we've learned and some of the questions we have and vice versa. So a couple of themes that I hope that we're able to touch on are one, and Milton really touched on it in the beginning, is this notion of collaboration, this notion of how do we connect the dots? How do we break down silos? Because I was trying to think about, it's become a cliche. It's almost kind of like my New Year's resolution to eat less donuts, right? You know you should do it, but somehow you still don't do it. So why is that? And talk through a little bit why, what can we do to force ourselves and push ourselves to break down silos, to collaborate, to better connect the dots. So that's one important theme. A second is really looking and thinking about that nexus between eliminating poverty in a place-based way with improving child well-being, because obviously they are very connected. And for us, that really distills to how can we act locally? How can we act at that neighborhood level, but also disrupt systemically? Because you have to be able to go back and forth in terms of being able to work on the ground, but also think about how this plays out at the systemic level. And the third piece, and something that we're highly focused on this year is, it's great to have a vision, to have kind of this aspirational goal, but it ultimately comes down to execution. And for us, I've distilled it to this Henry Ford quote I found, which says that vision without execution is just hallucination. And I was like, that's right. So that's our kind of mantra for 2018. So I want to tell you a little bit about the place-based work that we do, or we support, and I would say we, as Milton uses it, the collective we, because this is not about the foundation, it's about all of us working together with our partners. So I'm going to show you a quick video that gives you a sense of the work.
got to have the original people that's from this neighborhood to be involved in order to reach our people. You can't make a plan without us.
We have called English Avenue the community of broken promises, because for so many years that's what we have experienced. What I want you to know today marks a new milestone in the life of our community.
We're trying to get the neighborhood to use that clinic again. We'd love to see you come up there for your health needs.
I've been here doing community health work, advocating for this community. I want to see everybody do well. I want to see everybody shine.
We have a lot of kids that go through a lot, you know. Sometimes you may not know, like you see them for the first day, you know, they all smiling and stuff, but when they leave here, they going through a struggle.
We get a lot of referrals that on paper look like ADHD, ODD kind of behaviors, but what we're finding across schools, across districts is so much trauma. They were just evicted, their housing unstable, they've doubled up with another family and they're all in one room looking for more stable employment. There's a lot of basic needs, and until they're met, we can't possibly think that they're going to be able to come in and focus on treatment.
My goal in life, I do want to own a home. I do have adult children, and I do want to be a good role model for them. I want to also have a home that belongs to us, and no matter what, I don't have to worry about being homeless anymore because I own my own. It's mine, regardless. My legacy.
Keys to financial success. A budget helps.
I heard about the On the Rise Financial Center through the Westside Works program to help me bridge between living homelessly and to getting on my feet.
This is a graduate of our Westside Works culinary program. We are actually getting a concession stand on the 300 level called West Nest. It is going to be run by the students and myself and graduates.
I have to work at West Nest. I have to. The program gave so much to me, I gotta give back.
Anything starts out small, just like a seed of a tree. You see a little change, and then it catches on. It catches on a little bit more, until everything just comes into place.
And you can look back and see what the community used to be and what it is now. Only thing I can do is tip my hat to everyone who stayed in the neighborhood, and everyone who fought for the neighborhood, and everyone that reached out to help bring other partners in the neighborhood to beautify and to uplift this neighborhood. We need to stay and fight. We don't need to up and leave. It's what can I do in order to help change our neighborhood? What can we do?
So I'd like to show that video because it describes and captures much better than I could in about 4 minutes, I think the heart of what it is, both that we are trying to do on the West Side as well as how challenging it is. This, to me, they wanted us to highlight our approach and some of the things that we've learned, and one of the key things that every time I watch that is very humbling because it highlights how complex this work is. It highlights how hard it is, and so if you don't bring humility to this work, you're not going to really give yourself a reasonable shot at succeeding or even moving the needle. So that's one really key thing that I think is important to keep in mind. We've been at this for about 4 years, and I'm only going to talk for a few minutes. So in the questions I can go into more depth, but there's two important frameworks for us that really guide all the work we've done. The first is that This is something, and this is kind of the big theme of today, that you cannot do alone. A private foundation cannot make this happen by itself. The city of Atlanta cannot make this happen by itself. You need a public-private partnership. And not only do you need a public-private partnership, but you also need the community there. You need this three-legged stool for community revitalization of having all three sectors at the table. And not only at the table, but having a meaningful role. Because that's something that often gets left behind for community, is that you'll have kind of this tokenistic approach to, oh, okay, well, we'll go talk to them and to their MPU or the neighborhood association meeting will be done, say check. It has to be more. You have to do that and so much more. So that's an important aspect of this work, is how do you ground it in community? How do you ground it in the relational nature of revitalization? A second is, you heard a few of the stories of some of the different residents there, and it's one layer of a very complex onion that you have to kind of peel back, that highlights how complicated and how, in many ways, we're trying to impose order on chaos in terms of addressing intergenerational concentrated poverty. And so for us, the framework we've adopted to try to do that is really breaking out the work into these two big buckets of place and people. So when we think about place, we think about housing. So when we think of affordable housing, we think of supportive housing, market rate housing. We think about office, parks, commercial, all those things that constitute kind of the physical place. And then on the people side, we break it up into these 5 areas of health, crime and safety, education, economic inclusion, and civic empowerment. And in trying to move that work forward, we've helped create issue-specific collaboratives around health, economic inclusion, community retention, education, as well as workforce development. And these collaboratives are a cross-section of stakeholders of residents, community groups, nonprofits, funders, public entities, working together to first really understand what are the facts on the ground, what are those assets that are there, because it's not just deficits, right? We don't want to look at things through a deficit lens. What are the assets, but what are also be realistic about the liability, what are the challenges, and where are those gaps? And then developing plans that speak to those gaps and try to execute on that. And then now, as we've done that, how do we start implementing in a way that all the different collaboratives connect and talk to one another, which again is much easier said than done. But for us, fortunately, we've been at it for a few years and we have some good success. You saw a little bit of it up there in terms of the big, the big 3 things we heard from residents when we first started was, I want to have access to a job that allows me to take care of myself and my family. I want to feel safe walking down the street, and I want to feel good about where my kids go to school. And so that's where we started. Jobs was a big one. Arthur, our founder, Arthur Blankman, our founder, made a commitment to hire folks to help build the stadium, so that's where our investment started, and we helped stand up Westside Works, which is a workforce development center that since its inception in summer of 2014 has now placed a little over 500 Westside residents in living wage jobs in a few different industries with one-year retention rates a little over 75%, which is translated to about $12.5 million of income for themselves and their families, which is a great start. It's also translated to working with the Police Foundation and supporting its work with the neighborhood associations around a Westside security plan. And you saw a little bit of that there in terms of officer housing, security cameras, the At Promise Youth Center, and other initiatives that have led to about a 40% decrease in crime over the last 2 years. So these things are making a dent, and you have positive momentum. But now the big thing that we're hyper-focused on, I was talking a little bit about this with the folks at my table, is when we first started, people were very skeptical, and rightly so, that anything was going to happen, anything was going to change. And they thought this is just going to be like prior initiatives and no movement. But now they see movement. There's a lot of things happening right now. That I was saying, we've hit a tipping point about 2 months ago. So to give you a sense of that, when we first started, we were looking at, okay, how do you acquire some of these blighted properties and tear them down because they're an eyesore, there are safety issues and so on. You could buy a lot with property on it for $20,000. There was just a property listed in English Avenue, which is right across the street, 1,100 square feet, $239,000, like that. And that right now is kind of this existential threat and concern that we have, is how do we make sure legacy residents are able to stay and benefit from all the change? I'm not going to say, oh, we have plans, yeah, but it's going to be really, really hard. And I think we got to acknowledge that, and that's why it's so important for all of us to kind of work together. So I'm going to stop there because I think I've spoken more than I was supposed to, so I apologize. And I'm going to pass the baton on to one of our, I'm supposed to introduce both our, the folks on the panel, but I think you have in the bios what I was supposed to read anyway. So I'm just going to share some fun facts about them that I made up just now. No, actually, Renee's fact is not made up. She actually shared this with me. She was, and she wanted everyone to know this, she did, voted the friendliest person in 3rd grade. She's very proud of that. And then for John, according to his coworkers, this is what they told me, he thinks he is the Black Panther. So that's good. I can't wait to see it. So with that, the Black Panther.
All right, that was actually not so bad. I got really scared when you started talking about fun, because I thought maybe you had gone back. I was not the friendliest 3rd grade. So you didn't go back. You didn't do too much research. Hey, good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing? Good. So I'm John Majors. I work for an organization called Purpose-Built Communities, and we'll also talk a little bit about an organization here in Atlanta called Eastlake Foundation. But in a room like this, I'm imagining that you guys, a lot of you all, are familiar with. Show of hands, how many folks have heard of Purpose-Built and know, what we do and who we are? Yeah, pretty good. And how about Eastlake, the neighborhood, the Eastlake Foundation, etc.? Any Drew parents in here? I was thinking maybe we might have some, but I'm sure you guys know this story very well. So I'll try to just hit some highlights and talk about some of the points that I think are going to be particularly poignant for this audience, but then we'll have lots of time later if you guys want to kind of dig into any of the details. Now, I'll talk about this slide as well. Give you just some very quick background. Purpose-Built Communities is a nonprofit pro bono consulting firm, and I always have to say that again. We're nonprofit, but we're also pro bono, which means that we don't charge for our fees. We are in a very fortunate position that we have 3 family foundations that believe so much in this work that we do that they fund all of our salaries, all of our travel expenses, et cetera. We are formally working in 18 different cities around the country. And probably at any given point in conversations with another 30. So you can imagine the amount of travel and everything that's involved there. But we believe that, so I personally work in Omaha and I work in Birmingham and do some work in Columbus. We believe any money that's raised in Omaha or Columbus should stay in Omaha or Columbus. So it's really a fortunate position to be in. Purpose-Built was formed as a result, so when I talked about Eastlake, almost everybody's hands went up. So you guys know the story of Eastlake. It was this neighborhood that unfortunately was failing the families and especially the children who lived there in almost every way possible. 18 times the national crime rate, 5% of 5th graders were able to pass the state math standards. You had a stat that 90% of the families who live there were going to be the victim of a violent felony every year. The place was called Little Vietnam by a lot of people. And one of the most disturbing realities was that if you live there and something happened and you called 911, the police weren't coming until they had 3 or 4 carloads that they could come together. Well, think about, I'm a husband and a dad. I've got a 4-year-old little girl. So think about, what that feels like if you know that you are calling 911 and they're not coming. And you know they're not coming, and guess who else knows they're not coming? The bad guys. So just think about how that sort of changes, all these mild-mannered, well-dressed, love that bow tie, sir, people in this room. Put in that situation, think about the person that you'd become. And you see the reality in a lot of these communities. In the mid-90s, there was a New York Times article that talked about the prison population in New York State and how about 70% of the prisoners in New York State came from a handful of neighborhoods in New York City. And there's a gentleman here in Atlanta, iconic real estate developer named Tom Cousins, who read that article and he said, no way, that can't be true, that the majority of the prisoners in New York State come from a handful of neighborhoods. He ended up calling the Atlanta police captain and saying, I read this about New York, number one, do you think that's possible? And number two, is it possible here in Atlanta? And the police captain said, yeah, Tom, everybody knows that. And Tom said, wow, I didn't know that. What are some of the neighborhoods? And the police captain said, well, the first one, I'd say would be Eastlake. So Tom, being Tom, and I don't know if any of you in here know Tom, he jumped in his car and drove down there. That's what Tom would do. And he said, when he went down there and saw the kids and the sort of lack of opportunities that they had, he said, if I had been born in this neighborhood, I'd probably end up in prison as well, if they could have caught me, which, again, you have to know Tom. So partnered with the Atlanta Housing Authority, partnered with the residents and the community. Frank, you mentioned that, you hit on that. That is absolutely true. You've got to partner with the residents. You have to partner with the community. And a lot of the other organizations that were serving that neighborhood. And over time, some of those negative stats that I mentioned really started to improve. And so, crime's down, violent crimes are down 90%. It's one of the safest neighborhoods in Atlanta. Incomes are up, unemployment's down. And one of the really great stats is that every year, the school that was rebuilt there, Drew Charter School, every year is in the top 1, 2, or 3 spots in Atlanta public schools. Our kids, test scores meet and beat the performance of kids who live in $2 million homes around the country. There's a stat that I love to tell a few years ago at Drew Charter School, 100% of our 8th grade black boys were reading at or above grade level. That's almost unheard of in the country. Thanks. So about 1,000 people a year come, they see Eastlake, they say, wow, this is awesome, I want to do this back in, Kalamazoo or Kansas City or wherever they are. And what would happen is, they'd go back, they'd try it for 18, 24, 36 months, and they would have trouble replicating it. And so Mr. Cousins hired a couple of consulting firms, McKinsey, Bain, big name consulting firms, and said, what could we do to replicate this model successfully around the country? And the consulting firms came back with really 2 things, and this one always makes me chuckle. The first thing they said we need to do is create a consulting firm. So you ask consulting firms what you should do, they say create a consulting firm. So Purpose-Built Communities is that consulting firm that came out of that recommendation. And then the second thing they did, which I think is incredibly powerful, they reverse engineered what worked well in Eastlake. And then that became basically our purpose-built model. And I'll run through these really quickly. So we start with a defined neighborhood. So this is place-based work, and it is a very deep dive into a small area. So if you look at, you all know Eastlake. We didn't say, gosh, we're going to take on the entire east side of Atlanta. We didn't say we're going to take on the entire city of Atlanta. This is a deep dive into a neighborhood. To us, we think that's about a census tract. We think that's 15,000 residents, call it 5,000 households. And then all at the same time, these next 3 things. And we talked about working across sectors. So mixed income housing, cradle to college education, and community wellness, those are sort of 3 different areas. And guess what? There are people who are awesome at housing, people who know everything about education, and people who know everything about community wellness. They never speak to each other. They don't go to the same conferences. They have no opportunity to interact. And so what worked well in Eastlake was that it's mixed income housing, and the mixed income is incredibly important. There's a market rate component of everything, of all the housing that we work with and the groups that we work with around the country. The cradle to college education pipeline, the cradle part of that is incredible. Those stats that I just talked to you about, folks, students doing incredibly well, that starts at 6 weeks old. So if we go over to Eastlake right now, I can show you 6-week-old babies who are in language and literacy scaffolding. It takes that. And it's extremely expensive. So when you start talking about not being able to do this on your own, I tell folks it's about $18,000 a year, if not more, for high quality early learning. So the simple math on that is about $1,500 a month. The families who need that the most really cannot afford that. So you really do need strong partners here. And then the community wellness. That's everything that it takes to make a neighborhood a healthy neighborhood. All the things that we all look for in neighborhoods when we're excited about moving into a neighborhood. Safe, walkable streets, access to fresh fruits and vegetables, all those great things that make a neighborhood really work well. And the last thing, which we think is our secret sauce, if you will, is the community quarterback, which is a newly formed 501c3 organization, and they do nothing but say grace over all the other things going on in that neighborhood and make sure that the mixed income housing, the education pipeline, the community wellness work for and benefit the residents of that geography. So again, a defined neighborhood, mixed income housing, cradle to college education pipeline, community wellness, and a community quarterback. And that's sort of the reverse engineering of what worked at Eastlake, and that is the model for purpose-built as we work, like I said, in about 18 communities around the country formally, as well as at any given time in conversation with another 30. Interestingly enough, great news, we have a new network member, the Grove Park Foundation, which is actually here in Atlanta, just north of some of the areas where Frank's doing some work. I have a video I want to tee up, and this is a video of a really special event in the life of Eastlake, in the life of the neighborhood, in the life of the revitalization. It is the inaugural graduating class last year, 2017, the completion of the Cradle to College pipeline. So Drew Charter School had their first graduating class last year. And what I love about this is, number one, my background is real estate development, so how I sort of add value with the clients that we work with is I do a lot of helping folks think through the real estate financing strategy, a lot of acquisition of parcels for assemblage and that sort of thing. So I can get a little bit away from the mission sometimes just because I'm in a room talking about real estate, and it's kind of good to see the kids and to be reminded of the purpose, and pun intended there, of all this work. And I also love this video because I went to Catholic school for 12 years, and so we didn't have nearly as much fun as the kids you'll see in this video. And then after that, I think, Frank, are you gonna come back up and introduce Renee? So you're good? All right, so thank you all so much. We'll have time for more questions. Hope you guys enjoy this video as much as I do. Thanks, guys.
This school year, I think, means so much to not just me. I think the teachers that started Drew Charter Senior Academy in 9th grade. I think it means so much to the elementary school teachers that taught these students, so much to our founding principal, Mr. McKnight. I think all of us genuinely have this nervous excitement. We love these students. We love Drew, and we are anxious and excited for them.
I was a teacher of those students when they were in 2nd and 3rd and 4th grade, so I've known them almost their whole lives. So for them to be graduating and on time and going to such prestigious schools, it's just amazing to see that what Drew and what the Eastlake community effort has tried to do is actually coming to fruition.
Prior to Drew Charter School starting about 17 years ago, the outcomes for young people in this community were really poor. Less than a third of the young people graduated from high school, and today we have 100% of our inaugural senior class graduating from the Drew Charter School Senior Academy.
It is surreal watching my baby become a young man. He started in this building, 5th grade. And he's been here since then, all the way up to 12th grade now, and he plans to go to school and major in political science and African American studies. Then finish there, go to law school, and once he finishes law school, he has dreams of being a Supreme Court justice.
I've been here since kindergarten, so I'm finishing the Cradle to College pipeline.
There will never be a first graduating class again. They have They have trailblazed. I mean, they are setting the path. They will establish many of the traditions that will, continue on for years to come.
We kind of like are the staple for this building. We set the road, we set the example, and for the elementary academy and just the middle school students and just the students under us in high school. That just means that all of this, everything, life, it's real, it's coming, can't stop it. Soon enough, I'll be on someone's college campus.
College.
Yeah, with the legacy class.
It seems like just yesterday we were starting off as freshmen in the Kennedy building, and now I'm really excited.
It is spring of 2017. College acceptances are rolling in.
I'm just very excited. Like, I can't even put it in words. This is like the biggest thing ever. Like, it is. At first, it felt like we knew it was real, but it's like it feels real now. Like we're living here. Yeah. College. I'm Taylor Anderson, and this fall I will be attending Mercer University.
Hello, my name is John Ali. And this fall, I'll be attending Morehouse College!
Good morning, Greater Atlanta. Thank you for welcoming me to your beautiful city. I'm honored to be here today, but really, I have to follow that? Really? I also have another really statement of, I'm starting to wonder, why am I here? I mean, excuse me, United Way of Greater Atlanta and partners, transparent data on child well-being, ambitious North Star goals, people collaborating like gangbusters. I don't have anything to add, but I'm so proud of the work you're all doing. And I'm excited to learn and as excited as everyone else to kind of get into the discussion. So thanks. I'm going to follow suit and not be up at the podium because I'll just pretend I'm at home and with family, okay? So I'll talk a little bit about some of the work we've been doing in Boston and what we've been learning, and then would love to open up the discussion to learn from you all. Couple themes that will come up in this conversation just to put you on notice. Courage. We're going to be talking a bit about courage this morning. Conversation. We're going to talk about conversation and connection. Now, none of these are large academic words or complex theories, but it is absolutely necessary for us to push ourselves in this direction. I also have your traditional objectives. We'll talk about childhood adversities and well-being. We'll talk about how we use a trauma-informed framework to align systems of care and education. And we'll be talking about strategies to build community capacity. And you've already heard so many wonderful strategies this morning. But following the example of Mr. Little, I can't proceed with this conversation without acknowledging the tragic events of yesterday. Exactly 1 year ago, I was in Broward County, Florida, presenting to their Early Learning Coalition. Spent a few days with them, learned from the wonderful, incredible work that they're doing. It is absolutely heartbreaking that that community is facing this right now. But we're all facing this. This is not a tragedy that an individual community is facing, because as much as we need to go deep in our local efforts, as much as we need to love and care and be committed to our local community work and deeply engage, we are inextricably connected. And it takes a lot of courage to acknowledge that irrespective of what we do locally, we are connected in a larger meta network, and what is happening elsewhere in this country and elsewhere in this world is affecting our children here. And it's affecting all of our life chances. So there is a bigger ask and a bigger call to care beyond and to connect beyond. So I'm honored to be invited today because I'm honored to be able to connect with the communities and the work here, because that's going to inspire and drive and motivate the work that I'm doing with partners in Boston. There are toxic levels of violence that children are experiencing in their homes, schools, and communities far beyond the national tragedy that occurred yesterday, right now. So we have to acknowledge, and we have some decisions to make about if this is the society we envision for ourselves and what type of change is necessary if this is not. So you know that early childhood is a powerful time. You know, you're born with a brain, but that brain is not fully developed. It is the social experiences and the social environment that shapes your brain, shapes your cognition, shapes your language and motor skills. So there's a huge opportunity in early childhood. And those first relationships, those fundamental early attachments, shape the relationships you continue to form throughout your life. But there's a vulnerability there, because if you fail to nurture and enrich that early period of time, you do not get that time back. And we have to do more with less fruitful results later. At the same point in time, we know that there are effective, wonderful enrichment programs, smart social programs that make a difference for children, but not everyone has access to them, guaranteed access, or continual access to them. So we like to frame ourselves as a nation that values our children. Children are our most valuable asset. But where is the evidence of us prioritizing that with our systems and structures? So I'm a primary care pediatrician. I don't have any special training in this work. I was trained in a medical model. I should be looking at someone's throat or treating the flu right now, you know, but I come to this work with a particular heart for the proportion of children that experience chronic adversities in early life. And when I talk about chronic adversities, I mean interpersonal violence, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, family violence, intimate partner violence in the home, but also the adverse social environments, chronic housing insecurity, concentrated neighborhood disadvantage, community violence, and the contribution that these factors play to health throughout the life course. Now, the evidence is in. We know from public health, we know from economics, we know from neurobiology that these toxic social exposures are as toxic to the developing brains and bodies of children as a chemical neurotoxin like lead paint exposure. So we know definitively that these have enduring consequences on your health and well-being and chances throughout the life course. Now, why is that the case? Why is it so important that we can actually understand that mechanism and utilize it as we shape our work? So we talk about the fight or flight response, right? You're about to get hit by a car. What does your body do? You know, your blood pressure goes up, your heart rate goes up. Hans Cieli, controversial figure, but he helped us understand that fight or flight response. One of the things he said is incredibly insightful. It's not the stress that kills us, but our reaction to it. Our reaction to it. We talk about stress as if it's a thing. Stress is here, stress is affecting me, I'm stressed out. But actually, people experience what we would consider the same stressor in very, very different ways. And those differences are so important. So one thought is about why early childhood adversities would have such an impact later on in life is abiding risk, right? So we just talked about the developing brain, very unformed early on in life. So if you're exposed to particular degrees of neglect early on in childhood, people don't talk to you, your language development will not develop in an optimal way. So during critical periods of brain development, that can have a big influence on your neuroplasticity and development over life. The other thought is that early disadvantage is associated with other disadvantages. You're exposed to a major trauma right in August. Something happens in your neighborhood, you lose a loved one, you come into 9th grade and you have to sit down and learn algebra, but you haven't healed from that. So you might not pass algebra that year, you might not pass or graduate high school on time. It accumulates slowly but surely over time, more of a pathway. But the third pathway is the one that's most insidious and the one we often don't recognize. If I fell down right here, broke my leg, everyone would hop up and help me. No one would just see me there writhing in pain with the bones sticking out, right? Make sure I get to the hospital, get surgery, do my physical therapy, do everything I need to do. But chances are we're sitting next to someone in this room right now who we can tell has major anxiety or major depression or is going through something heavy. And we might not say a word to that person about it. We do not respond to emotional wounds with the same level of urgency or directness that we do to physical wounds. So they exist and carry forward without sufficient acknowledgement or treatment. They're carried on in life. So it's a very insidious process that's in some ways socially and culturally supported. We have to move beyond the level of the individual to think about the community environment. So this is for some of the work from the Prevention Institute. When we think about communities, we think about equitable opportunity structures, we think about the physical and built environment, we think about the sociocultural environment. We have to think about community trauma in very much the same way. Intergenerational poverty, chronic underemployment, high levels of mobility, concentrated disadvantage, deteriorated unsafe spaces, poor social cohesion and low civic engagement. All of these factors trickle down into the social and cultural and everyday life experiences of children. So when we talk about community trauma, it's not just witnessing events of violence in the community. It's not just direct exposures that happen to you. It's how the whole ecosystem of the community affects the way in which adults engage with each other, engage with schools, engage with children. So it's much broader and more complex, and it's why these more complex ways of working together and collaborating are so vitally important, because none of us own one particular way of creating safe social spaces, equitable social spaces. So a lot of times when we talk about trauma and adversity, we're thinking about these as factors that are taking place for individuals. So I want to share an example. This, I believe, is the Atlanta Aquarium, if I'm correct, right? I wish I could visit that today, but I love going to aquariums, right? You know, you're under the sea, Sebastian, Ariel, you're just watching the fish and the tortoises swim, and you get lost in that experience. And you're like, this is what they do. This is how it exists underwater. But then you notice that there's that very thick, super thick glass that's actually dictating the patterns that the fish swim in, dictating the way in which they're living. So you're not just witnessing life, you're witnessing life within a structure. This is social structure. This is social systems. These are social forces. If you do not practice making yourself see them, you will just see yourself as witnessing, this is just the way that family is living. This is the way this child is choosing to behave. You're not seeing the impact of social structure and social forces on that behavior, on the circumstances in which the family or child are making decisions. You're not seeing the impact of school segregation in the past on the way in which schools function today. So we're neglecting a whole series of things that are actually determining what we see today. So this is a practice, and we have to utilize this practice for a broad range of social forces, including community trauma and early childhood adversity. Very important to begin seeing the glass and to always ask yourself where that glass is. I want to take a moment to talk about resilience. Where does resilience come from? We have a common perception that resilience is a characteristic of individuals. There are resilient children, there are resilient families, there are resilient communities. It's like this personal characteristic. But I want to use some of the industry literature to push us to think about dimensions of resilience. So let's think about resilience as the capacity to recover from an adversity, to withstand a future adversity, or to adapt to an ongoing adversity, right? So withstand, what do I mean by that? Well, we commonly say if you can grow up here, you can grow up anywhere, right? It's kind of this survival mentality that if you withstand these challenges, you will come through with grit, character, strength, it develops you in some way. And some of that is cultural mythology, and there's some truth to that too. But the ability to withstand what we know about how you would modify that for a child, what we know from research, is it actually is social supports and community assets that make the difference. So if you can surround a child with a deeper degree of opportunity structures in their community and intentional social supports, they are more likely to be able to withstand adversities that they will face in the future. Let's think about recovery, right? So when we think about recovering from adversities, we think about neighborhoods of opportunity that are intentionally, purposefully built, right? Where there's opportunity for safety, health, and prosperity in the future. Reestablishing a sense of safety is incredibly important to recovery. So recovery involves that caregivers understand how trauma presents in children, understand what trauma, how it impacts learning, how it impacts social relationships and behavior, have the leadership and advocacy skills to advocate for the resources children need to recover, even those insidious, more invisible processes. So that means thinking about behaviors not just as what's wrong with the child, but what happened to the child. That small paradigm shift is a part of recovery. When we think about community factors that allow for that, well, you have to leverage social and political capital to make those social, emotional resources available to children. There have to be economic and educational opportunities that make sense if you want children to recover from adversities. When we think about adaptation, well, there are children who will have chronic housing insecurity. There are children who will experience chronic food insecurity. There are children who are going to exist in homes where there is a lot of tension and anger, and conflicts are resolved in not the most positive way. So we have to begin to reclaim narratives. We have to set a North Star vision or goal that's just not going to be okay with us to have that chronically evolving over time. We really have to think about how do we create a series of social interactions and healing spaces that allow children to heal while enduring ongoing adversities that are taking a while to resolve. And this also involves us thinking about intergenerational trauma and how that plays out in relationships between parents and children, as well as historical trauma and what that means for how communities respond to adversities. So thinking a little bit about community-based strategies, we know our systems of care are siloed, and we know protective factors for families are integrated, right? So we know we need to be here. We talked about trauma. Trauma is an adaptation to environmental conditions. So we have to reestablish safety and support, and we have to coordinate opportunities to promote prevention. So a little bit about what we've done locally has been a reorientation of our focus. At Vital Village, we're based at Boston Medical Center, but we're very outwardly facing. It's all about a co-design, collaborative process between community members and community-based agencies to maximize social and emotional well-being for children and families. And we focus on something that people say is kind of not worth focusing on. How do we build the capacity of the community to promote social emotional well-being? Not just directly build that for individual families. How do we create communities that have a higher level of capacity for sustaining that and scaling that for every family? And a lot of what we do is we take this framework around trauma and early childhood adversity and ask non-traditional partners how they would incorporate it in their work. So not just those who are engaged in violence prevention, but those who don't see their work as being connected to violence or trauma at all. What is the role of a trauma-informed framework around school tardies and absences? What is driving those school tardies and absences? If you can step back and think about the contribution of trauma, it leads to a different set of strategies and a different set of partnerships. So we do simple things that have already been discussed. Collaboration, always begin with listening, with the expectation that there are already solutions within the community that we will find, and those are the things that need to be scaled up. And then really thinking about what set of collective actions could we use to promote equity, and what would be the models and methods for us to really create equitable governance structures and decision-making structures, right? So the most important thing is a community of practice, right? So we really think about this in a very, very simple way. We call it hubs of collaboration. It is not getting the entire city to work together differently. It is getting a local library, a local school, a local health center to work together in a way that they haven't before. So really on the micro level, and those micro level examples growing and sustaining and setting an example for others to come on board. So really creating a system of communication and opportunities that's different. Probably the biggest and most important piece of our work is a leadership development trajectory for community members. So the goal is that the community is really directing and leading every aspect of this work. We've had a lot of fail forwards in this model, but we call it a community service leadership model, where there's civic engagement that's directly tied to a leadership trajectory and a peer-to-peer mentoring structure. So one example is in our baby cafe cluster model. We're focusing on social emotional well-being, but there's breastfeeding support, attachment, addressing hardship, social support. None of this is agency directed. This is all led by community volunteers who are mentored by other volunteers. And the whole project's kind of directed by other volunteers. So it's a tiered leadership structure, all led by community members. We bring a variety of agencies to the table that are non-traditional partners in this area, and they have a specific set of asks, but they take their direction from the community volunteers and the civically engaged leaders. So a lot of it is matching a need for an agency with the intentions and goals and vision of the community partners. This is spread to about 10 different locations locally, spread by these leaders. So who are they? Like, who are these volunteers? What are the characteristics? They're mission-driven people. Mission-driven people who have a social justice orientation. They have a desire to educate and learn. It's a key difference between someone like me who's trained in pediatrics. When's the last time your doctor wanted to learn from you, right? Can you remember your last visit? How much listening did they do? How much learning from you do they do? Different orientation. They see the people they're serving in the community as wisdom experts as well, that they want to learn from, as well as to educate and work with. Very different balance of power, service orientation, empowerment, and community-minded. We've done a very similar model with teachers around trauma-sensitive school practices, beginning with the educators and what their desires were, designing the curriculum based on that, and really empowering them to do iterative improvements over time. We often think about who we are missing. Often we're missing in many of our public health and healthcare programs and early childhood and education programs oriented heavily towards the mother. It's a huge missed opportunity. We have a prenatal care system that asks about mother's mental health, postpartum depression, home visiting, all of those things. I just talked about childhood adversities, intergenerational trauma. Where are there opportunities for fathers to have mental health resources provided to them? Fathers to deal with interpersonal violence that you witnessed as a child. Where are there opportunities to heal from that? Expecting a child is a major life event, and potentially a triggering event for someone who did not have a close relationship with their father or close male role models. So we missed the opportunity. I have a colleague, Charles Daniels, who's developed a model called pre-father care, parallel course for fathers focused on their mental well-being during the prenatal period. This is not impossible, it just requires some thoughtfulness. We had a meeting on Monday all focused on discipline. There were mothers in the room who had lost their sons to violence in the street that they felt was really associated in part to the inability to have support from male role models. In that meeting were about 5 different organizations focused on dads, and they just simply said, thank you for being there. So sometimes we're just bringing resources together to amplify them, amplify that work that's already created. The final thing I'll talk about is the role of shared data. I love what you all are doing with data. It's so important to be transparent. We've tried to do very similar thing, taking a repository of all the existing data and pushing that out to the community, and then having the community ask about specific data that might not exist and pushing that into our dashboard. So the dashboard, it's all publicly available online. We use something called the Child's Opportunity Index. So I guess to orient you to the map, really yellow areas have very, very low participation in early child care, right? The red areas are neighborhoods we know that have low opportunities, but they have high levels of participation. So what starts to happen when you visualize data like this is you start to go after those bright spots. Why are they outperforming what you would expect based on the level of opportunity in that neighborhood? What can we learn from what they're doing that we can spread to other places? So we use these maps to identify positive deviance. We identify the places that are not performing as they would be predicted, and we elevate them and learn from them. We also incorporate young people in their voice, their vision through photo voice. This is students routing their walk to school and talking about transportation equity issues in the community. This was an ask of community members. Where are their places, where are their pantries, food markets? How do we make those accessible for every community member to find the closest one to them? But we didn't just share the data, we also shared the stories of families and young people and their experience. Sometimes people don't go to food pantries because you're not made to feel welcome there. Sometimes you don't go to food pantries because the food you get there has mites in it and then causes a bigger problem at your home. So the other thing that emerged from this was the ability for residents to comment on the quality of the food and the services they were receiving. So if you have high levels of diabetes in your community and the pantries are only giving starches, that's a problem. It's not necessarily a beneficial resource in that way. So how do we put this all together? Well, it's already been said, define geographic area. Community investment is essential. Partnerships, funding, multi-level interventions. We're really thinking about ways that you sustain efforts, and we do that by working on not building anything new, but only enhancing what's existing. A community of practice where peers are leading and learning for peers, and everyone is doing evaluation and improvement. That's the spread, and then the scale is really civic leadership and service up to the level of policy. So we really think about how each aspect, and I can talk more about this in detail because I know from time-wise, but the one thing I want to highlight about this is that a lot of times when we're doing this work, we have more of a deficit model, where it's like limited resources, limited opportunities. We take the opposite. We expect that there's actually abundance of wisdom, abundance of smart ideas, despite the fact that communities may be performing under what we would want them to be. They would be worse if people within the communities hadn't come up with some really good solutions that should be scaled. So our orientation is solution seeking, not problem finding. So thank you all so much for your time. Again, courage is collective, conversations are a gateway, and intentional social change. Thank you.
If you have a question, just kind of lift it up and they'll collect and they'll bring it to me. I'll go ahead as those are being collected, and I'll start with a question of my own for each of them, and then switch over to your questions. So I'll start with Renee, since she just spoke, and I loved your presentation. One thing that, at least that we see with our partners, is this focus on community capacity, because it is so important, so real. We're really hard, and the leadership development, and we're definitely experiencing the fail. We're trying to fail forward, right, and learn from some of these things. So I just would be curious if you could talk a little bit more about that and some of the things that have gone really well, and maybe some of the things that haven't gone as well.
Yeah, so we think about particular dimensions of capacity we're aiming to build. So the first capacity we wanted to build was, most of our partners are always in do mode, constantly doing, but you never have an opportunity to kind of say, is what we're doing working? How would we even begin to evaluate that? And when that happens, it's an external evaluator. So one of the capacities we've tried to build is we just chop down to the lowest level of measurement. If you host a family play group, what is your goal of that group? And what is measurable on a clipboard with a piece of paper? If your goal is that parents leave that workshop engaging with their child in a different way, what is the visible evidence that that's happening? Is it just the agency workers that are working with children and parents are talking in the corner? Or are parents actually learning what's being modeled and then taking that home with their children? So that's an observational evaluation, and it doesn't cost any money, right? And so how do we chop away? And so we strip out that language of evaluation, we call it improvement, and everyone learns improvement. Everyone learns the science of improvement, and it doesn't require a specialist or an expert to come in. That's very empowering, because then you have your data and you have your information beyond the anecdote that something is taking place, or how do you improve? Again, some people call PDSA cycles, we call them feedback loops. For everything you do, what is the feedback loop? What is the improvement that would happen next time? So it's just one example. I'd just share briefly a second example with data. The way we did data in the beginning was highly controversial. It always led to screaming because we always showed the same negative data. So we had to transform that. So actually everyone has data to share. Your personal narrative is your beginning data. And if everything in society has told you that that narrative is unimportant, the first step is really reclaiming that narrative and empowering someone to begin with their own story and using their own story as advocacy and then building from there.
So on the flip side then, what have you all found to be the hardest kind of nut to crack as it relates to this stuff?
I think data was hard. Was hard in multiple levels. I think sometimes we fall down on the job around conversations. So we've started a series around courageous conversations. We make a lot of assumptions in our work that when we talk about equity, we all mean the same thing. When we talk about discipline, we all mean the same thing. When we talk about child well-being, we all mean the same thing. Mental well-being, we mean the same thing. We don't. So that actually requires a lot of ongoing, intentional conversations that get at what we mean when we're using language, so we actually can align our work.
Great, thank you. John, so you all do, you replicate this work now in multiple sites in Atlanta, but really all across the country. What have you all found to be the thing that is easiest to be able to translate to another context, and what has been the hardest?
It's a great question. So it's all difficult. Every community is distinct. Every community has its own separate context. Excuse me. So when we go into a neighborhood, one of the first things that I try to beat people to the punch and say, I know this isn't Atlanta, because that's the first thing that people say. And there's a lot of truth to that. Atlanta is a very, very special place. I think there are many places where when you start to talk about race and you start to talk about poverty, those things really line up. And that's not the case necessarily in Atlanta. You have a very, very strong black middle class here. a black middle class that a lot of other cities would give their right arm for. And so going into another city, like I said, that's the first thing on everybody's mind, so I just try to beat them to the punch and say, I get it, I know it's not Atlanta. The piece that is never easy to replicate, but it's something that we can often, get some agreement around the table on, is that when you start looking at children and you start looking at the outcomes, and especially to your point, Dr. Renee, you start looking at data, right? Because people will say, well, we've got great schools in this neighborhood. We just put $20 million into the capital campaign to redo this school. But okay, let's pull the testing scores. Let's look at let's look at well-being measures, not the building. And so once we start to look at that data and we say, X percent of these kids are on target to graduate, okay, if you had multiple kids, which of your kids would you choose to not graduate from high school? You go, oh, well, none of my kids. I want all my kids to graduate. Yeah, well, we want all these kids to graduate from high school. So that conversation's not easy, but at least it's something we can all rally around.
Great. All right, I'm going to try to lift up some of these questions here. So what suggestions would you have for communities attempting place-based work but struggling with changes, quotes, redevelopment, that make it difficult for legacy community members to stay and grow with their community to participate in its promising future?
We have to talk about gentrification. It's a part of the conversation. I think when we're talking about achieving equity in education and health, there's a level that's deeply uncomfortable. We do a good job of giving, I wouldn't say we could do a good job of giving everyone the same, but when we develop social programs, we try to develop it so that everyone gets the same thing, right? We sometimes have access and quality issues, but programs are usually not developed in a tailored way. But if we really want to address legacies of historical trauma, legacies of redlining, legacies of school segregation, legacies of adversities that have affected families over generations, doing the same is not going to achieve the same result for those children. It actually might widen inequities in outcomes. And so we see that time and time again. And so it says we have to do different things in order to truly create an equitable outcome. It's a redistribution of resources if we're working from a limited bucket of resources. So I think there's a real question around economic redistribution and capital in order to achieve the goal of equity. But I think the good part of that is that we have an abundance of compassion. We have an abundance of commitment. We have, that's not needing a redistribution. And I think at the end of the day, when those things are leveraged towards the economic development portion and they're balanced with that, we make different decisions.
If I could add to that, I just would say that I agree with that. And that is always going to be a challenge. And on top of that, I think, and this gets back to something you said earlier, I think when we start talking about trauma, we start talking about what children are living with and intergenerational trauma. These are some really difficult conversations. And I think people don't like having, as a rule, people don't like having very difficult conversations. And a lot of it is also people don't have the vocabulary. If we, start going through some of the just historical realities about redlining and who had access to VA mortgages, I tell people all the time, if you want to hear some incredible stories, find a 90-year-old Black World War II veteran and ask them how they were treated when they got back home from serving their country. And, and if I put my business school hat on, there's a formula, and I won't bore you all with it, called the time value of money, right? So money that, people didn't get or have access to from VA mortgages or the GI Bill to go to college, which are some of the key ways that you build wealth, right? So if your grandfather didn't have access to that 70 years ago, that disparity doesn't go away over 70 years. It grows exponentially, literally exponentially. That's the way the formula works over time. And number one, a lot of people don't even know that. Number two, a lot of people would find it very difficult to have that conversation. So I find that to be one of the major challenges. And gentrification is certainly a challenge. But one of the things, and I always think about that, and this is sort of more Johnism maybe than purpose-built. When I was in business school, one of my professors talked about Gatorade. And he said, 10 years ago, I didn't even know that my body had electrolytes. I didn't even know what they were. He said, but now I can't finish a workout without immediately thinking, oh, I gotta go get some Gatorade. Because somehow, some way, we were able to educate the masses about what electrolytes are and how important they are. And if we can do that for electrolytes and Gatorade, I think we can do that for intergenerational trauma and disparities. So I'm hopeful, at least. So.
The one thing I would add to that, because I think to me, one of the things I read in that question was, I think where you started, Renee, in terms of gentrification, so one of the things I wish we had done better is plan for success. So we knew going in, if we were successful in trying to push revitalization, because we've seen it in other parts of Atlanta and all across the country, that property and values were going to start to appreciate, because from my perspective, the biggest threat to place-based work is the people who you're trying to help support are gone. Because then you don't have time to think through and figure out how you break down intergenerational poverty, because they've moved to Clayton County or they've moved somewhere else. And so from my perspective, I think that is really critical, is plan for success and really be intentional and aggressive when the properties are $20,000 versus $239,000, because you're going to be able to do a lot more. And I won't bore you with it now, but I'm happy to stay if the person asked that question, because that's a big focus for us from a community retention perspective, and thinking about what are those interventions that we can help support with partners, with our community quarterback, to help ensure that homeowners can stay, that renters can stay, and small business owners can stay, because those are three affected parties and they have different displacement concerns or challenges, and you got to figure out how you help address them. I like this one. Can you share one, all caps, big mistake made in your place-based work and the lessons learned? Start with John this time.
Oh.
I'll put Renee on the spot.
I think exactly what you just said, Frank. We go into different communities around the country, and it's interesting because the work at Eastlake, so the video I showed you guys, that's 20 years in, right? So that's, that little girl, young woman, she was saying, I went to kindergarten at Drew. So, she's an example of the process, but that's 20 years in. So we're it's like Groundhog Day a little bit. We're starting off and having conversations in communities that look like what Eastlake looked like before. And when we tell them, you need to raise as much capital as you can and buy as much dirt as you can while it's, $6,000 for a lot or whatever, they laugh at us. And they say, that will never be a problem in this neighborhood. And we know it will. Like you said, if you're planning for success, when you have and we work with half charter schools, half schools that are partnerships with the district, but they're all public schools. When you have a public school option that is really doing through the roof results, parents are going to figure a way to get their kids into that school. And one of the things that we are very, very adamant on is a neighborhood preference. So in order for you to guarantee that your kid gets into that school, we say we want you to live in the neighborhood, move into the neighborhood. And those dynamics are going to spur price appreciation in real estate. And we tell people as much as we can up front. But like I said, I mean, they literally laugh at us. So, I mean, it's unfortunately, it's not a big mistake that we've just made. It's a big mistake that I think we're getting more and more people to believe us now when they come to East Lake, and we can show them sort of what has happened over time. But people look at neighborhoods in every city, and they've got a neighborhood where if you had $100,000, you could buy up the whole neighborhood, but it will not be like that. And once the property's $230,000, there's nothing you can do with that. There's no affordable housing solution to be had there.
I would build on that. One of the communities we work with in Roxbury, the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, 30 years ago when there was illegal dumping in that neighborhood, they developed a land trust, right? So you own the house, but the land underneath is owned by the community. And so that's preserved some space while gentrification is kind of rapidly occurring at this point in time now, 30 years later. But I would extend that idea, right? We have separate pools of funding for crime, for education, for health. You cannot convince me that a dollar that makes a community safer does not have a benefit on the educational outcomes for children, because kids cannot get to school if they have to go through an unsafe place. You can't convince me it doesn't have a benefit for child health because they can't play outside if it's not a safe community. So we have to develop a trust, more shared pools of money that are supporting child well-being in a more intentional, long-term vision way. We have very short-term thinking around our outcomes, and that's not what's happening in early childhood. The biggest investment for those children that just graduated from Drew, we're not seeing it with their graduation. It's when they're parents. It's when they're 40. That's when we're seeing the full extent of what that early investment really is. So our outcomes, we have to push those further out. And we have plenty of longitudinal studies that show us that that is the case in terms of their productivity, their contributions, and the outcomes for their children. This is an issue for all of us as a nation. What we do in early childhood with kids affects all of us later. As we can see with Broward County, expulsion is not going to be a solution for a community, right? It's a short-term solution. It is not a solution that creates safety for anyone's children. So the big lesson we learned was we were thinking way too small about what community engagement and civic engagement could possibly be. Trainings, workshops, empower, go home, go do good work. That is not. Each of us in this room, it was a long developmental process to bring us to this room right now. People cared about you, thought you had value, invested in you over time. You built capital over time. It is the exact same thing with the communities that we are working with and partnering with. People need time, and it takes time to undo what has been done over your entire life, socially and through your portrayals in the media and through all of your experiences. So you want to invite parents in to collaborate with schools. Coming into the school could be a horrible experience if you were treated as an ignorant, uneducated, not smart person in school. So we wonder why parents scream and yell and do things that you wouldn't expect, a response that you wouldn't expect. We have to begin to think about the shoes that they've walked in over time. So just inviting someone to a table is insufficient. So we had to go much, much deeper. And that was also a much more long-term commitment. And also accepting people for who they are, not wanting to change them. Big piece.
We have a question from the audience. Jeff?
Good morning. I'm Bobby Jordan, and I'm with the GIVE from Henry County. My question to the panel, and I think Renee was answering some of it, it was to John in terms of the difficult conversation around the World War II veteran, that is, the abuse and abuse. So my question is, where and when do we start a conversation as we recognize the different barriers that have erected themselves through time? What steps, where, when, and then looking at the language and the labeling that we sometimes are guilty of when we look at someone that we want to render assistance to.
Thank you. So I don't think there's ever a bad time or place to start that conversation. What I would say is that, it's going to require a lot of patience because it's not an easy conversation. It's not an easy conversation, and it's not a simple conversation. I mean, there is a book, I think it's Richard Rothstein, The Color of Law, that's out now, and it's very popular, but he really breaks down a lot of the history of which, again, frankly, I mean, I didn't even know a lot of it. I think Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow might be, another good sort of starting place. The Equal Justice Initiative, Brian Stevenson, another sort of good place to start having some of those conversations. So I'm sorry, there was a second part to the question. What was the second part of the question? Oh, so language and labeling, that's a big deal, right? So you go into communities, and I love what you said, Renee. You said, you look at what people, I'm going to paraphrase it, what people basically have done to survive the challenges in their communities. And these communities would actually be in much rougher shape if people hadn't been just brilliant in the things that they've come up with. So one of the stats I didn't talk about in Eastlake is that there was a $35 million a year drug trade. People are not stupid. I mean, you sell drugs, you get the math wrong, there are dire consequences, right? So people are not dumb. It's the ways that they have developed to they're brilliant. The fact that they could survive neighborhoods oftentimes. And I don't know that we give the right amount of credit for the brilliance that it takes for a little kid in a tough neighborhood to have 6 or 7 different ways to school depending on what's going on throughout that neighborhood at any given point in time. So when you start talking about, and so then we're out helping folks put their fundraising narrative together, and we have to be very cautious about sort of selling a particular neighborhood or community as, sort of this really just distressed place, right? Because people who live in neighborhoods, oftentimes, they don't see their communities as distressed places. They may see their community as a place that, is full of brilliance in lots of capacity, and it's just been underinvested, and that's not the fault of the people who live there. So I think you have to be very careful as we're thinking through this work to not be offensive. Number one, to not be offensive in our language and to give credit in our thoughts.
This may sound like not the answer you're expecting, but I think we have to ask ourselves, when we listen to children, do we believe them? Do we believe what they have to say? And I want to give 2 examples because I think this is critical to the work we need to do moving forward. I think kids are actually in a better place to be honest with adults about some of the things that are baggage for us, so it's actually hard for us to correct them. USA Gymnastics, we don't need to go through. There were a lot of children that weren't listened to, so we have to acknowledge that. I have a colleague, Walter Gilman, at Yale. The work we understand around the disparities in preschool expulsions with black boys, he's the person who helped do that. He was giving a talk in Nevada about 2 weeks ago, and I'll share an example. He said there was an 8-year-old in the room, and he was presenting on some new work that also shows that teachers tend to pay attention to the behaviors of African American boys more so than others in the classroom. This leads to more acknowledgement of a behavior that might be at fault. The child said, "We knew this, we just didn't know that you adults knew this." Very insightful. When kids say things, do we believe them or do we perceive them as just children saying things? I'll share one second example. I had the privilege of being on a panel with a 17 and an 18-year-old from the Lakota tribe, one of our Native American tribes. And they began to ask adults in the community about what happened with the boarding schools. Children were removed from homes, sent to boarding schools, ultimately returned to community. These were their parents, the children who had been sent away. They didn't want to talk about that history, but the children asked them. And then they went on a project of actually taking and reclaiming and bringing some of the children who died at the boarding school home to the homeland to be buried. So I think some of this work, we actually, because of our own baggage, are not in the best place to lead, but we need to begin to pay attention what children are observing about us and take them seriously and listen to them. I think that's some of the process of honoring them as true human beings that have something to add to the discussion about child well-being.
So we have time for two more questions.
Hi, yes, my name is Paisha Odom from Centennial Academy, and I have a question. How did you, if you did, work with your homeless population? We're a conversion charter school that almost like a model like Drew. However, we service the 3 shelters that's in downtown Atlanta. And one of the biggest obstacle I have is the gentrification and the shelters being in the downtown area and trying to work with them, and they cannot stay in our school zone. So my mobility rate is one of the highest in the city because it's 36%. And them trying to actually find a place to stay. So when we wrap our arms around them, they then have to leave and we lose. So did you come across that, and what's the best way of doing it? Again, the shelters are in down right here. This is our school area from Atlantic Station to Castleberry Hill. And the biggest issue is that the affordability coming out the shelter is none.
I'm so glad you raised that question. This is why we need to work together, right? Because I would raise my hand and say, I don't know anything about homelessness. That's not my expertise. Housing's not my expertise. But here is a perfect example. We know from data, every time a child changes schools, they lose about how many days of learning? Is it 60, 90? They lose about 3 months of their education that year. That is completely unacceptable. This is a policy issue. And then funding to bus them to where they need to go. The other thing we know, I don't know if anyone saw the beautiful New York Times series about Dasani. It was a homeless family. It was several years ago. They did like a 6-part series on this family. They had to start a foundation because people were so concerned with what happened with this family. But one of the key strengths that was illuminated in that series, it was called Invisible Child, because New York City has the highest homeless rate since the Great Depression currently. But one of the key insights in that series was for this child with a very turbulent home environment, chronic housing insecurity, many challenges the parents and extended family were facing. The biggest factor in this child's life, and we know this from research, was the support and care of her teachers and her principal at her school. And the fact that she could continue in that school was a big protective factor. So we know sometimes we can't fix everything with families, and we know homelessness is a gateway to numerous additional challenges a family will face. But we need to make sure that we are surrounding the child with a network of caregivers, educators that can invest in that child's life. And we do subject them
inadvertently to more traumatic ruptures for a child who, because of adversity, is going to have issues with attachment. So we're not using the science and our compassion to dictate our programs, because we could do things a different way.
All right. Is there one more question? No, I'll go back to the cards. So place-based work can be very powerful for the people inside the boundary, particularly for pilot efforts. How do you replicate, all caps, funding to bring solutions to other places, often just a zip code away?
That was a big mistake we made in the beginning. You have to think about sustainable funding from the very beginning. One of our biggest weaknesses is we have not effectively engaged the business community. I saw a beautiful slogan from the Chamber of Commerce from Kansas City called that we're in the business of compassion. And I just think that the business community can very much connect and are deeply invested if we give them the opportunity in well-being of children and families. And there's smart ways. There are many two-generation models where parents are working with associated childcare. All the big companies do that because they know that it contributes to their productivity. We have examples from other countries internationally that their productivity is incredibly high because they promote the well-being of families. So we can do it.
So one of the things that we realized early on, and we try to keep it top of mind, is that there will never be enough public funding available or philanthropic funding available to really tackle this problem nationwide. And so, excuse me, one of the things that we really look to do is to jumpstart a private investment model. And so we want to create places where individuals and families will make the decision that, hey, you know what, I want to invest in my home. I want to do things like, maybe move into a particular neighborhood because I want the amenities and things that are available. And of course, that gets into sort of this, double-edged sword about that increasing property values, but we will never be able to publicly fund or use philanthropic funding to solve all those problems. But if we can create environments where grocery stores say, hey, you know what? I want to move into this neighborhood, not only because it's the right thing for the families and the children living there, but it's also a good business decision. So how can we work on the factors that can help to create and spark those sorts of reactions?
I'll add my 2 cents as a funder, because this may have been directed at me.
Funding was in all caps.
Yeah, it was in all caps. So I'll give you 2 answers. One is the very practical answer of, I think a lot of this, for us on the West Side, the catalyst was our founders building a new stadium right down the street. And that created this window of opportunity to really get and motivate a lot of folks to invest a lot of money. On the West Side, in the last few years, there's been over $100 million committed to just this area, of which we're almost 40 million of that. And you're not gonna be able to do that everywhere. So that's one thing that I think is important to keep in mind, but a lot of it is about, at least in the short term, you're thinking about what can I do if I'm working in this area, is how do you, for lack of a better term, sell what you have here, right? How do you sell it in a way that isn't exploitative, right? But highlights both, here are some of the assets, but here are some of the challenges in that kind of community balance sheet, and get to the right folks who can help dedicate some resources to it, right? So I think that's a very practical, again, I'll stay if this person has a question on that specifically. I think more broadly though, part of why you have to do work, whether it's on the West Side or the other different parts of Boston, or across the country in the communities that Purpose-Built works in, at a high level, what we're trying to do is get the market to work again. Right? Because there's parts of Atlanta that don't need any of these things. They just function. You don't have any of a lot of these added supports or what have you. So how do you get the market to work again in these communities, right? Because part of the role of philanthropy and foundations is how do we help kind of, we are able to take more risk, hopefully have a longer term time horizon, and create some proof points that enable the broader public to say, okay, this is what we need to do to fix that. And from a sustainability perspective, think about how then either you have a policy change, to Renee's earlier point, or you have the public sector take on certain things, right? And I'll give you the most immediate example we have is working with the Westside Future Fund, which is our community quarterback on the West Side. One of the first things they stood up about almost a year ago was a anti-tax or anti-displacement tax relief fund, which was really focused on how do we ensure that existing homeowners are able to stay? Well, basically, and we're committed funding to it, is any tax increases from now for the next 20 years will be covered by this privately funded fund, right? Public sector, you run into all kinds of issues right now if you try to do it, and it'd take like 5 years if you're lucky to get there. So something you can move very quickly. So in that respect, the private sector and philanthropy primarily is leading that. But that is not, one, sustainable over the long term. It's really just 20 years, and it's only one set of neighborhoods. And when we know, in fact, especially given how the re-urbanization trend you see in Atlanta and across the country, that's going to affect a lot of neighborhoods. And so, to me, we're buying time to prove out that this helps keep people here. And then hopefully we collectively have to work on part of that's a function of how we fund public schools through the property tax here in Georgia. So we need to address that, but that doesn't take 1, 2, 3, or even 4 or 5 years. It's a longer term proposition to get those kinds of shifts. So from my perspective, it again goes back to how you help the folks to kind of go. I love the analogy you used with the aquarium and the folks. How do you help the fishes that are in the whale shark? I think that was a whale shark. That was in there within their environment. But then how do you work on that class and changing that? That's a longer term proposition. So I think we're done. I first want to just thank our great panelists, Renee and the Black Panther. And then he's going to close us out.
Hey everyone, I'm Tim Packenham. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the United Way of Greater Atlanta, and I've been assigned a very brief task which is within the range of my aptitudes, and that's to say thank you. Thank you to Frank and John and Renee for your great input and guidance. Thanks you to as well to all the attendees and your organizations. First for being here, and secondly for what you do. You know, we use a lot of C words in this work: community, collaboration, convening, and on, compassion. The one word that I hear a lot and is very empowering for somebody like me and for our community investors is commitment. Your attendance here exhibits a rare community commitment and a huge amount of power to make the change in the circumstances, frankly, the appalling set of circumstances we have in Greater Atlanta around child well-being and family and neighborhood health. I was at a meeting with a committee of community investors this morning before I came here, and I am encouraged to be able to report to you that we really are building a lexicon. We're building a common terminology around the challenge we have to build the future state in Metro Atlanta, and the InForum sessions are a huge part of that. In fact, in many ways, it's the driver. And so we're talking with the same language, using the same kinds of data visualization and the same kinds of approaches in discussing the problems with our investors who are wanting to know about outcomes, as you guys are in terms of defining and figuring out how to tackle the challenges. So thank you so much for all you do. Now I have to look at this piece of paper because I need to give you the exact correct data for the next InForum, which is March 15th. It'll be back here at this place. The topic is power and trust at the intersection of race, place, and poverty. And featured will be Tiziana Deering from the Center for Social Innovation at Boston College, and Rohit Malhotra from the Center for Civic Innovation. So please mark your calendars and attend. We appreciate your recommitment in year 2 of InForum. Lastly, I've been asked to note that Dr. Renee will be around to chat with you and share some of her amazing wisdom for a little while after I turn this mic off. So thank you all very much. Thank you.